It is Friday, March 18th here in Draft Shark Studios in Rochester, New York. Welcome to our third installment of Best Ball Friday. I'm your host, Matt Schauf, and with me today, another terrific guest to help us sharpen our best ball drafting toolkits. He is a best ball analyst for Establish the Run. He is the 2020 champion of Underdog's Best Ball Mania tournament. He is Justin Herzig on Twitter because in real life, that's who he is, Justin Herzig. Justin, thank you very much for joining me today.
Cheers, Matt. It's great to be here. Always fun to spend a Friday doing either some drafting, some talking, anything best ball related.
Yeah, I appreciate you not only pulling yourself away from some best ball drafts, although they're probably running in the background as we talk here. But I mean, NCAA tournament, I saw you even giving out some free bracket advice just before the tournament started.
Yeah, and if you look closely, you would have seen that the data kind of suggests you should use Kentucky to win it all. So that went out well.
My 13-year-old daughter filled out a bracket for the first time, mostly stuck with favorites, but Kentucky was like the one non-number one seed that she had in the Final Four. And I was just explaining to her 2 days ago when I asked her about it. I was like, I can still remember when I was around your age and I had Syracuse going from the 2 spot into the Final Four and they lost to Richmond, and I had Arizona going to the Final Four and they lost to Santa Clara. So get ready for it, kid. She was feeling great after her first couple of teams won, and then last night that happened right after she went to bed. And this morning, I'm like, "Welcome to bracket life, kid."
You should break it down. Tell her she can take solace in the fact that she actually chose a very high leveraged, high expected value strategy, and that'll help her sleep at night.
Yeah, it should be like, whatever. What does leverage mean?
I just wanted a cat, and Kentucky has the cats.
I don't even know what you're talking about. I don't remember doing that. So we'll move on from life with 13-year-old girls because that's a whole other series of podcasts. We'll get back to best ball talk because that's what I'm imagining people are here to listen to today. Now, Justin, you said recently on Twitter, of course, that the Superflex tournament on Underdog right now, which is, at the center of the Underdog best ball focus right now. So you said that reminds you a lot of the good old days of 2019. So first of all, tell me about those good old days and what has changed to the nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, best ball is still a fairly new concept. And yeah, you had some of kind of the peripheral websites, some of the smallers, the MFL 10s and stuff that, you got a little feel for it, but it really wasn't until kind of the website Draft, which was the precursor to Underdog, that made it just very easy, simple. I could be doing it on my phone. And I think that's was at least when I first really started getting into it. But you also didn't have the amount of data. You didn't have the amount of people who were giving, kind of analytic strategy, talking through roster construction, all of that. And so in the early days, a lot of it was really around like, hey, using intuition and thinking through like this strategy makes sense. And maybe you had small pieces of data or something, or last year's results or something. But at the end of the day, like it wasn't to the point it is now. And even now, it is still very, very new. But when we see this Superflex, like, I think it's so interesting to see people have such strong convictions, strong opinions on it, but still at the end of the day, we're all learning on this. And I think why I enjoy it the most so much is that I can kind of, just take a step and actually start thinking about like, hey, how do you really beat this new game? And where I think I've enjoyed the most and where I've had the most success in the past is taking on new games that are, primarily football related, but you look at second half NFL Showdown or when the XFL came out, like those were areas where you couldn't just go and, use the work that people have already done, but using your own actual process, I think is a bit more valuable. And I don't know, I just also, it's more intrigued and interested in that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, if you play fantasy, if you played fantasy for a while, and if you came to it as fantasy, as opposed to like, as a data person and like, oh, I found these numbers, so now I'm going to play this game because I found this way to play it. I think if you came to fantasy as a fantasy player, you have to like a format that forces everybody to feel their way through it and try to figure out what works. Obviously, you need to figure out what actually makes sense. You can't just come up with something out of nowhere and expect it to work just because it's different. But what have you found, I guess, specifically for this format? How did you attack this one? And maybe in general, how do you go about beginning to attack a new format that arises?
Yeah. So specifically for Superflex, I kind of just started thinking about like, okay, what do I need to actually win this game? And then I think about, okay, where are their potential edges? And so for this example, well, the rankings for when it starts off are pretty comparable to what the rankings were for, the just normal traditional one. And like, yes, the QBs very quickly adapted, but things like the wide receivers are still very comparable to where they stand in relation to running backs in this, even though you have one fewer wide receiver that's necessary. And so that's something where, maybe there's opportunity like, hey, if we're drafting 3-4 wide receivers in the first round, or maybe comparable before we're drafting the 6th, 7th, 8th running back in traditional, if you need one fewer wide receiver, shouldn't those maybe start dropping down? And so just trying to think about like how throughout the draft room this starts playing. And then the second is like around like those quarterbacks aspects. How many quarterbacks should you actually have? And so I'm just thinking about like when I think about the strategies that I like for traditional, you want maybe 4 running backs. I'm a bit on the hyper fragile, maybe 5 running backs, but you're still looking at about, okay, maybe 2x the amount of positions that you can actually start. And with wide receivers, you can start 3 or 4, and you're still happy to get anywhere between 7, 8, 9, maybe even 10. And so now you're looking at, okay, 2 to 2.5. Now, quarterbacks, I'm now likely going to try to be playing 2 quarterbacks every week. Yes, that super flex spot can be filled with another position, but when it is half PPR scoring, I'm looking for that most likely to be a quarterback. So how many quarterbacks should I be going for? Well, 4 feels right, even though 4 feels like a lot of quarterbacks for what used to be a onesie position. And there's some worlds where you might actually want 5 depending on the quality. And I don't think having 2.5 of, 2.5x of what you can start for that position is too much when that's comparable to what we've done elsewhere. Sometimes you even go with the tight ends, you grab 3 or such. And so is that right? I'm not sure, but that's the way I kind of just think through about like, okay, what should my construction really look like here? How do I build that? And then it's looking at the ADPs to say, okay, where are people maybe overdrafting to reach somewhere when I'm thinking about the larger structure of my team?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean that's where it's fun to think through because you don't have the answer. You can't say, well, this is what won the tournament last year. You can kind of logic your way through it, but we'll see what actually works this year. It sounds like you have landed primarily on 4 quarterbacks, maybe something in the 5 to 6 running back range. Is that your primary roster construction for the super flex tournament? And obviously, the wide receivers and tight ends to follow.
Yeah, I mean, it obviously differs on a per draft basis, but in general, I would say I'm leaving most draft rooms with about 4 QBs. The only time I'm doing 3 is if I'm pretty much starting QB. Otherwise, and when I'm starting QB, that second round QB, I usually feel is a bit of a stretch compared to what else is out there. At this time, I'm willing to be a bit more, take risks and willing to take chances. So like Tom Brady was one where you were drafting him with ADPs of like 170, and more likely he was not going to return and it was going to be a bust. But now that he is starting, he's turned into a second round QB, if not into the first round QB. Like that opportunity we always knew was there, and that's where there's opportunity to take risk. And so primarily, I think I didn't have a ton of him, but I had around probably 12%. And on those teams, though, it was building for, okay, I'm going to go stud everywhere else and go with a 4-5 QB build and hope that either Malik Willis, Tom Brady, maybe even Desmond Ridder, like these guys who have the upside if they find their way into the starting position, and play for that. So overall, I would say, yeah, I'm mostly trying to go for those 4 QBs. Running backs, I've been going a bit heavier on the running backs early on just because we see that they are dropping. And again, you only need 2 wide receivers. So ideally, I'm starting 3 running backs every week because the guys that in traditional would be going kind of early 3rd, end of the 2nd are now going like 5th or 6th round.
Have you found that they're falling beyond where you think they should, even outside of Superflex in the 1 quarterback format? Because that's the way it seemed to me in these early drafts.
Yeah, and I think it has to do with roster control. So like Ezekiel Elliott is the guy that always, I don't know, it comes around with my name a lot because I think he's one of the unique plays where the data suggests that Zeke is not a good person to be on your best ball team. Because even when he played every game, he still averages 15 points per game. It's the old quote of if you draft Zeke, you are paying to know who your RB2 is rather than, I forget the rest of it, but like, or what points you're going to get because you can get those points elsewhere. But for me, with a guy like drafting Zeke, it allows me to say, okay, I'm going to only now draft 3 or 4, and I'm going to make up at the other position and excel at those others. Because yes, it does not make sense to draft someone like Zeke, who at his current state, we don't think he has the upside or whatever. But then you're also wasting another 4 or 5 positions for that. If you are only drafting 4 running backs, I think Zeke is a great complement, especially now his ADP in Superflex is something like 67, I think, for the starting running back on a high-powered offense that has probably going to catch more passes as well with what we've seen with that offense. And so like that's an example where I think as long as you're building your strategy around, he can still be a core component, and getting drafted in the 7th round of Superflex, or I think it was starting to go like 5th round of traditional, is just too much value for me.
Oh yeah, he might have to play defensive end for them this year too, the way free agency is going. So we'll see. Yeah, I mean he's a good example because obviously you look at him and he's a deteriorating player at this point. But if you're drafting him in round 5 and you're drafting him for a Cowboys team that clearly believes he can still play and is saying publicly, "Oh, he was hurt last year. Zeke's still our guy. All we need is opportunity." That's the king here. Tom Brady killed me because I could understand, if you take him late and he comes back, it's a huge value. But I couldn't get past the idea that he's always so packaged. I was sure that if he chose to announce his retirement, that it was for real and he was retiring. I honestly, I at this point, I'm like, how could you not just take a few chances that he would miss it? I'm kicking myself. I'm glad that there was one super flex draft where my turn came up, slow draft, and the 2 people who picked in front of me did not take him for whatever reason. I was like, oh, thank God, I have 1 share. So at least this is the team I'm going to be shining a light on and watching all season.
Yeah, and I mean, then the question becomes, okay, so if not him, who next? And how else? What can we learn from that example that maybe profit off? And like maybe you could have gone with the Deshaun Watson. For me, honestly, his price was still too high, even with all the lack of clarity. He was still being drafted in like the 3rd, 4th round of Superflex. So I didn't get much Deshaun because I just think the price, like the upside was already, the risk was already baked in. The price was already baked in, so like you weren't getting substantial value there. But for me, like Malik Willis is an example where I think he's my number 1 owned quarterback, and I have him on, I think, like over 30% of teams. Because there's a decent chance he gets drafted by Carolina at that 6th spot, ends up having to sit for the entire year, and it ends up being a bust, and that team's not going to be great. But if he does actually start, play and starting, like he's a guy who's going to be averaging more than 20 points per game. And when you're comparing that to the other QBs that are around him, that's the upside that I'm playing for. And yes, it takes a bit more of a risk tolerance. And yeah, you can say, well, if you draft more, then you're willing to take that. But that's at least for my strategy is where can I take risks on guys there? If the situation works out well, they can win a league for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can certainly understand the case for Willis. I am drafting for some volume, but I'm not a max level drafter. So I've been leaning away from Malik Willis and instead kind of favoring the other rookie quarterbacks, Sam Howell, Desmond Ridder, who are going later, who have the experience edge in college, who, if they land in the right spot, could start this year. But, they also, to me, there's less risk because I'm taking them later and not taking them ahead of guys like Baker Mayfield, who a couple weeks ago I thought was sure to be a starter for somebody. I guess we'll see where he lands. But I guess my question from that is, do you kind of agree with that sort of difference for a different sort of best ball player, the person who's not maxing out their exposure and then needs to find some different edges in there?
Yeah, I mean, if you're drafting for fun, you draft for fun and just have fun with the app. It is what it is, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if I'm going to go enter the Millie Maker, normal DFS and competing against 300,000 other lineups, and even if I'm only entering 1 lineup or 2 lineups, I'm still going to build that lineup with a level of contrarian. I'm still going to build that lineup that has that ability to create, that is the highest EV lineup possible, that has a chance at winning it. And I think best ball's the same way. If I'm only going to do 1, 5, 10 drafts, I should still be drafting using the edge, using the contrarian, using the risk profile for hoping that I can get there. Now, if your goal is just to kind of double your money and you want to play it safe, you should probably not be playing these big tournaments because so much of the money is in that high upside prize pool. And it's why last year, I ended up not taking it down, but it was sitting in first for the DK for the Millie for a while. I ended up finishing 4th. And that was all because I invested heavily in that Kansas City Cincinnati game. Like even all the way down to my last pick was probably Darrell Williams. and he had a big game there. But the goal was, I want to optimize teams that have a chance at winning that major prize pool. And because as DraftKings, as Underdogs, as these other sites are trying to create these larger prize pools that have first up, a lot to first, and there's going to be continued like proliferation of, okay, who has that highest first place prize? Even if you're only drafting 1, 5, 10 best ball, you should still be trying to optimize for how you can give yourself a legitimate shot at winning that first place.
Mm-hmm. Now, kind of pulling away from Superflex, because most of these are still going to not be Superflex, even though that's in the spotlight right now. How have the optimal roster builds fared year to year? Is last year's top performing builds, are you finding that they are carrying over to next year's results? I know you said we're still early in this, so we're probably still working in small samples, but how sticky is the roster construction just in terms of, numbers at each position year to year?
Yeah, I think the tails, when I say tails, I mean the lineups, the constructions that were not used that often, their success kind of varies a bit more than the rest. So for example, I would have thought 2 years ago, like the Travis Kelce with just one tight end team would have been very successful because of the huge year he had. It ended up not being that way. But if you look into the data to understand why that was, it was because if you were drafting Kelce, you also were not drafting whoever the stud was that blew up that year. I guess it was Derrick Henry. I'm trying to think who was number one overall. I think Christian McCaffrey got hurt that year. Who was two? Yeah. But same idea with like if you have those very high win rates. And so much of like the win rate data and the success data is based off where those players were drafted. If a guy in the first or second round ended up blowing up. So what I'm using to say this is it helps as we get more year over year data. But I think at the end of the day, like your roster construction has to make sense. And that's where like the hyper fragile, when I was drafting that 2 years ago, was doing it because I felt this made sense. I wanted to hit on those running backs. And if they did hit, then I could find, plug holes with depth in all the other positions. But last year, what we started realizing is that the wide receivers all started getting steamed. So many more wide receivers are being drafted in those 8th, 9th, 10th round as people just kind of stacked up as more people went for a hyper fragile build. Last year, my predominant build ended up being 5 running backs. And again, this is 18-person team, so it's going to be different this year with 20. But realizing that when I was doing 4 running backs, I wasn't drafting what was an example of Tony Pollard in the 10th or James White in the 10th because it was a little too much cost. Last year, those same guys, the Alexander Madison and such, they were getting pushed back to like the 14th, 15th round. And now I'm like, okay, because all the wide receivers are getting pushed up, it now makes more sense for me to add in that additional running back to go with the 5 running back build. Mm-hmm. So if I know I'm going to take more chances on that, I'm probably now going to not take my second or third running back as early. And so just learning from where the kind of drafts formed to how I'm going to adapt my strategy early on, not just at the end of the draft with that 5 running back. And this year, I think like I have my same idea for how I think you can play to win with roster construction, but how others are drafting and where the kind of tide goes is how you'll have to kind of adapt. And I think with now everyone going with the 20, or at least the 2 core sites I play, DraftKings and Underdog, going with 20 roster spots, it'll be interesting to see how that changes things a bit, primarily at the QB and tight end position.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How have you seen it change so far with Underdog going to that 20 spot? I think DraftKings was 20 rounds last year, right? But Underdog added the 2 spots this year. How have you seen that alter the way people are drafting this year?
Yeah, I think primarily people are going with safer and saying, hey, I'm going to go 3 quarterbacks. I'm going to go 3 tight ends. Whether or not that's right or wrong, I'm not 100% sure. Personally, I lean towards 3 QBs is definitely the right play. I think, Hayden showed some great data. Hayden Winks from Underdog showed some great data on why that was. And I think intuitively it makes sense. It's the highest scoring position. It makes sense that, hey, even if you have a stud early on, there's still value to kind of get in those spike weeks from your QBs, because when you do get a spike week, it hits. For me, I think the people who are going with 3 tight end just to have 3 tight end is probably in the wrong spot there. And the reason why is because, so if you're drafting the number 26, 27th QB, he can still have spike weeks, and those spike weeks are still probably 25 plus points. If you're drafting the 26, 27th tight end on the board, unless you're getting that crazy breakout season, the Dalton Schultz for last year, the Darren Waller from a few years before, like unless you're attacking like a breakout profile tight end, you're not going to get spike weeks. Because if you're getting that Austin Hooper at the end and his spike week is 50 yards and a touchdown, well, okay, so 50 yards, 5 catches, you're at 7.5. Touchdown is now putting 6. You're at 12 and 13.5. That's still only 13.5 points for if you had a bad tight end week, you were probably still getting 7. So your gain in that spike week is 6 points. But when we were talking quarterback, I'm willing to take that spike week because it's now 25 versus maybe a bad week with substantially fewer or a bye week or something. Mm-hmm. And so that's where I try to think about like, how do I remain, where should I be taking my chances? And I'm really focusing on using the extra roster spots for the breakout candidates that can have the Amon St. Brown end of last season or something, rather than just the ones who are going to plug in and give me a few extra points each week.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that point about not just trying to get 3 tight ends for the sake of having 3 tight ends, but thinking about where that's coming from and exactly who you're considering, especially now that we're actually getting landing spots for some of these guys and seeing who the league doesn't care about in the early days of free agency. There has been some debate on diversifying player portfolios. And I mean, first of all, Twitter debates are usually silly to some degree and often to a large degree because they're usually fractured arguments. People are taking one thing and trying to argue against it and not realizing that if you take this, I don't know, it's funny to me when people try to attack a strategy that is clearly trying to be different from the way most people are drafting and talking about how it doesn't work and not realizing that the fact that you're arguing against it is kind of why it works. Because if everybody adapted 0 RB, it's not going to be an effective strategy. So I guess, first of all, how do you look at these Twitter debates? Are any of them valuable? Do you find yourself getting caught up in them?
Do I find myself getting caught up in them? I definitely read them. Occasionally I'll pop in. Usually I'll pop in if it's people that I know that if I disagree, are not getting offended, and people that are either online or real friends with. So I don't have a problem there. Mm-hmm. Are they valuable? I think just for a lot of people who are, passive Twitter users, maybe not as, trying to learn their game of best ball. I think they are just good discussions. You're not going to get hey, this is the definitive response or answer to any of these, but it helps you just kind of think through considerations. Because a lot of people might think hey, I wasn't actually thinking about should I be diversifying my ownership? Wasn't thinking about should I be diversifying my roster constructions? The conversations maybe at least just start that internal monologue for you. For me personally, I think diversification makes complete sense. And I think we can get into the more details, but I think there's different ways to use it and different reasons you should be using different kinds of diversification.
Yeah. So you say I diversify because I have an edge in other areas. Where are your particular edges?
Yeah. And I mean, this has obviously changed over the years. But I think okay, so, and yeah, the conversation that Eric and I were having and kind of what I was trying to get at is I believe that there is still substantial edge from drafts if you just follow the basics. Similar to if you were to say, hey, if you go play ABC poker, you can still be a cash profitable grinder playing 1-2 no limit or whatever, just for fun and casual. The reason why is because there's enough people who are there for purely entertainment that are not taking the level of, preparation, process improvement that you are, and you're just going to be able to capitalize on that. And so I would say on average, and, as a result of this conversation, I kind of looked through my previous drafts. I think around 3 drafters, every draft I'm in are pretty much complete dead. And you're talking now, that's okay. You've got 25% edge just because you are not making the dumb mistakes. And the dumb mistakes I'm talking about are just poor roster construction, completely reaching for ADP, auto drafting, things like that. Okay. So now you accept you've got edge on 3 out of the 12 in the draft. How do you now continue to get edge? Well, that's where I think now you start breaking down and okay, so you got the basic of the roster construction, your lineup telling a story. There's zigging while others are zagging. And I think each of those might add 5%, 3%, whatever it is. And that's how you kind of keep grinding those edges. But one point that Eric is definitely correct about is all the things that people said they had an edge on, and the things that I believe I had a very strong edge on 2-3 years ago, I may not have nearly as much of an edge now because there is a lot more data and analytics and stuff that are coming out there now. How tight that our hive mind is and how many people are actually outside our bubble, I'm not sure. But it's a valid point that like, okay, we need to continue to improve. And so I now like look into this season. I'm like, okay, where is my edge coming from? And I think the two things that I've really been able to highlight, which we touched on a little, are risk appetite and kind of range of outcomes of players. And so I am very willing to take high risks on players. And we saw it with the Brady example. I'm willing to do it with a ton of the rookies right now. And because the range of outcomes of these rookies is phenomenal. We've never seen these players in the NFL. They could very easily turn into, we never see them on the field. They never actually play. And that's perfectly okay. And I'm willing to embrace that. But if we also have the option, like what's more likely? A rookie that's even like the 6th, 7th wide receiver rookie. You can use like Sky Moore is the fun one as an example. What's more likely that he breaks out and turns into a PPR monster in the playoffs of the end of the season, and he turns into, let's say, like a wide receiver 1/2, or someone who's also going to draft around him, like a Marvin Jones. Like we know what Marvin Jones is. We know the system he's in. He's never going to have that upside. He's likely going to have a lot higher floor than any rookie wide receiver that's drafted around him. But I'm far more willing to lean into those high risk, high range of outcome opportunities. And so I think that's like an example, like one small example where are some people doing it? Yes, definitely. But because that Marvin Jones still has the same ADP as the rookies around him, there's enough people that aren't, that there's still like an edge in that example. And we'll go back to the super flex, but drafting Marvin Jones when you only need 2 wide receivers, you're likely going to have 6, 7, 8 wide receivers in your team. If you drafted a couple guys early, like what is Marvin Jones really doing for you? And that's where like I'm specifically looking for, whether it's rookies that potentially can come into scoring in that top 2, top 3 for my team, which is necessary to actually produce.
So in this scenario, are you taking Sky Moore or are you taking Marvin Jones?
Sky, well, 99% of the time it'll be Sky Moore. I don't think I have any Marvin Jones. I probably have less than a very, very small percent, if any, on my teams.
That's what I thought. I just wanted to make sure that I was following the logic here. It's interesting to look at that Jacksonville situation in particular, because Marvin Jones is falling now that they've signed some guys. Zay Jones has also fallen. Zay Jones has been an interesting example to me because, I guess, first of all, nobody believed in him because it was a short stretch, and it was maybe one spot where I guess he didn't flash well enough late last season for recency bias to push him up, because we've seen it happen with other guys, Rashad Penny, for example, who I think we'll get to in a few minutes. But it's been interesting to me that Zay Jones has now signed a multi-year deal where he's getting $10 million a year, and his ADP has fallen from where it was. Do you look for individual spots like that, players that you start to focus on more once something like that happens in general? And I guess, are you interested in Zay Jones as wide receiver 92 off the board or wherever he is today?
Yeah, so I'm looking at my phone right now and my exposure and stuff. I'm honestly surprised his ADP was dropping. I did not expect that. He is for pre-draft best ball, he is my fourth highest owned wide receiver at 25%. And he was an example for me where we saw what he was able to do the last kind of 6 weeks of the season. I think I don't know. I don't think many people even know like what he was able to do. I'm going to pull up his stats real quick as we're talking, but he was highly efficient. He was catching downfield targets, and like he was showing like he could compete in this league. I'm pulling up game logs real quick. So to end the season last year, his last 4 games, he went 6 for 9, 67 yards, 6 for 8, 50 yards, 8 for 10, 125 for 8, 27. He did not have the touchdowns there. And so, I don't know, like it's not the sexiest, but it's also, he was getting drafted virtually free in these leagues. And I don't know, I think we saw him actually have some talent. And that's an example where I could see breaking out. I would have figured with this Jacksonville signing and how much they paid him, like you still have Trevor Lawrence. We've got the new coaching staff. They've shown invest in him. He's a guy that I'll probably continue to be drafting. Just didn't realize, his ADP is 222 in the Superflex right now, which is basically last round.
We talk about all the info that's out there right now. I guess it surprises me, even though it shouldn't, that there's still so much bias involved in these. And I feel like that's an edge that can be mined still, is recency bias, whatever other biases are at play here, because it doesn't make any sense for Zay Jones to go from free agent to $10 million a year and be drafted later. So he's somebody that I was drafting before. I was kind of figuring I would back off because once he has a team, he's going to climb. But if it's going in the other direction, I'm going to keep taking him as well. We talked a little bit about the diversification. You mentioned the percent on Zay Jones. Do you have these limits on your level of ownership for individual players that you just don't push past?
I wouldn't say I have a limit, but what I do is, and I'd say it's more so for the main tournaments when they come. So when we get those big ones after the draft and coming to the summer, what I'll do is I'd say every week or two, I'll probably take a look at my ownership and see which players I'm very high on. And from there, I'll do two things. One is I'll kind of dig a little further into that player and understand like, why am I so high on them? Why am I higher than market? And trying to kind of test like, should I actually be? Sometimes I'll be like, okay, and I'll talk to others too, and I'll get their thoughts and try to get the contrarian viewpoint of like, okay, what am I not seeing here? And from that process, I will then be like, okay, I'm drafting this player too high. These are the risks that I wasn't accounting for. This is the lack of upside I wasn't accounting for. And I'll probably draft that player less. Or the other is I'll be like, no, I see something different. I have conviction. But now what I'll probably do is say, okay, but could I be drafting this player around later? Because I'm still getting a ton of them. Should I now wait and maybe instead of me drafting him in the 9th, and I can likely get him more in the 10th because he's always available in the 9th for me and I'm reaching on him probably. So let me wait there. And now I'll see my percentage kind of go down a little there, but the shares of him I do get are now more valuable shares around later. So that's kind of my process with regards. Right now, I've got guys that are 44%. I think I have guys, Malik might be like around 40 or so. I don't have as much concern now because I think there's still so little information. As well, the contest I'm entering is one of only maybe 5, 6, 7 contests I'll end up doing. So even though my exposure at this point in time right now is really high in this specific contest, it's very possible that at the end of the summer, I'm not going to end up with a 40% plus exposure to any player.
Mm-hmm. So I guess getting more into the diversification, a couple different ways to go here. So first of all, how should somebody who's not a max entry tournament player go about diversifying? And I guess how much volume do you need to be playing where diversification is really that big a deal? Because there's wide variations in how much volume people are playing at this point. I think that's part of what was kind of silly about this particular Twitter argument, and which always pulls in all different people. So I guess I don't know. I'm not even sure what the first question is here is, but how do you start your focus on diversifying? You mentioned looking at your percentages now on guys and how it's going to spread out over the different tournaments that you play. For right now, how are you looking at it? How do you do it in an individual draft? Like, are you spreading it more around early round players and then condensing more as you get further into the draft? I guess just take me inside how you diversify.
So first off, there's two core concepts of diversification that I think are important for best ball. One is in your actual players, and two is kind of in your roster construction. You can even say in your strategy overall, but we'll focus on those two. For the roster construction one, I think you've just got to go into the drafts and think about, okay, which roster construction am I comfortable with? Which roster construction do I think gives me the most edge? For me personally, I focus really on two different roster constructions. One is kind of the more hyper fragile, which is let's exclude Superflex, but more traditional. Either I'm focusing on a hyper fragile where I'm probably drafting 2-3 running backs fairly early and then virtually none the rest of the draft. Or the other is I'm going with a 0 RB. I honestly prefer those two extremes of this. And in general, I like the top guys at each position have the greatest ability to really separate from the field. And so I want to get as many shots as possible at the ones who can really finish RB, wide receiver 1, tight end 1, whatever it is, not QB1 to be honest. But like finish at the top because that gap is so great. For me to do that, I'm usually investing, okay, so there's assets at the top, and then it's going to leave me a weakness at some position. And so that's where I'm willing to go with a level of depth to make up for it. Mm-hmm. And so it's usually that depth is either at running back or wide receiver. If I go hyper fragile early and I invest in those trying to hit on the elite running backs, only grabbing 2 or 3 of the elites, I'm willing to say, okay, my depth at wide receiver, and just hope that one or two of those late wide receivers end up hitting. And when you go the other way with a 0 RB, it's the same idea. I'm trying to hit on the number one wide receiver and a very strong 2 or 3 early in the draft. And I'm hoping that my volume, my quantity combined with maybe hitting 1 or 2 running backs makes up for that spot there. But to the diversification, which is really where it started. How should people really be thinking about it? I think, yeah. So with the roster construction, kind of just start thinking about what you want there and let the draft play out for how you diversify. Like, you obviously shouldn't go 0 RB if you have the 1 overall. If you are end of the draft, you have options, but it depends on the year and such. So let the draft come to you and then naturally get that. And I think you then maybe after however many drafts start getting a feel for which roster constructions you feel better at, which ones you want to kind of work in, maybe force that a little and go from there. Mm-hmm. From a player wise, it's really hard to do anything there unless you've actually started doing 10, 15, at least that many drafts. And then you're going on percentages and just really focus on your outliers, focus on the ones that you have at the very top and go through that process and ask yourself, why are you there? Are you drafting them maybe a little early, and consider there? And I think as you make your rankings, you'll start getting a little sneak peek into where you might be eventually overweight on someone, just where you have them versus ADP, and expect that, like, hey, overall, the drafts are fairly efficient. You don't have people that are reaching too high, at least not an underdog or this part of the year. So if you have someone substantially higher than ADP, you're going to end up higher than them. That's probably a good way to kind of forecast out where you may want to diversify or start assessing why you have that player where you do.
Mm-hmm. What level of entry volume do you think is, I don't want to say a mistake, kind of a mistake, but obviously it depends on what you're looking for from one of these tournaments. What level of entry volume is a mistake to be playing the tournament if you're, really looking to make money or going to be hurting if you don't?
I don't know. That's a tough question because I really don't think there's a wrong amount. Right. There's so many sites now. There's so many different contests that I don't think there's anything wrong with if you just want to throw a couple in because you want to have a chance at that and make it fun and like you're still hoping to make money. I think it's less about how many entries you're submitting and more about how much time are you putting into your process. Because if you are trying to make this a profitable endeavor, like you should probably obviously invest your time in the preparation. The other is I would hesitate to encourage anyone to really be playing best ball purely because they want to make money off of it. The amount of time that you put into it from an actual drafting, the ROI, the amount of time that your money is held, like it's just not a great investment or it's not really a great reason to be drafting best ball. I do it because I enjoy it. It's fun. I do it also because it really helps prepare me for the season throughout like DFS and things like that. And especially like being able to track and see and how these kind of, shift. And yeah, it is also great to have a chance at winning that million up top, the 200K up top, whatever it is. And like, that's a nice carrot. But I wouldn't really be a proponent of someone who is joining just because they want to squeak out an ROI.
Mm-hmm. So, you mentioned getting ready for the season, the DFS in particular, but how much of this can carry over to our regular redraft, follow it through the season leagues? And I guess also, how much is it different? What do you get out of your best ball drafting that you carry over to leagues that you follow throughout the season?
Yeah, I think it's huge. So if you're just considering generic redraft, I think getting an idea of where players are going, getting an idea of where others are higher on players, or in your case, where you're higher than average on players. And I think so many people they leave a draft room if they're only doing 1 or 2 drafts a year and just being like, oh, I didn't expect this to happen, or like, oh, I really wanted that player, but blah, blah. But you have the opportunity to literally do 10, 20, 100 drafts ahead of time. And obviously your 101st is going to be so much more natural and you're going to feel the flow and you're going to know what's going on than if you're only doing 1 or 2 drafts. So no question there. For me, for DFS, I think there's a really interesting way to how to really be contrarian in those first couple weeks and how to have increased familiarity with what's going to be contrarian because you've already seen the general public and what they think about players. And where you are also like considering from an upside perspective in those first couple weeks. So that's where I would say like, hey, me just having familiarity of the actual players, but also more importantly, me having familiarity with where the general consensus is on these players. And yes, I guess you could also just go look at ADP the day before the season starts and get that feel. But if you're not actually in there, if you're not in the actual drafting, I think to really digest it and incorporate in your process, you kind of need that.
And I think running through the actual drafts will show you some of the spots where things are going to divert from ADP because it's not going to follow that list for sure. So you can know how you might react to those things. It's funny to think of how long we spent. I don't know how long you've been playing fantasy, but it's funny to think of how long we spent doing mock drafts throughout the summer when we could have just been doing these for real drafts and had them actually play out and show us some results at the end of the year.
Yeah, 100%.
Let's talk about some of those specific players that we use these drafts to get used to. Are there any, you talked about Malik Willis being a favorite for you. Are there any zero share players for you? And, zero might not mean that you never draft him, but maybe you do. Are there guys that are just don't touch because of their prices for you?
Yeah, and so in general, I'm only drafting off price. So someone that might be a zero right now in a couple of weeks ends up being someone that's a target just because they've dropped. So I, very, very, very few players that I'm just completely out on. And if so, it's usually not, it's some other macro theme. So Calvin Ridley was an example at Calvin's current price, which was, I think he was going like third, fourth. When we think back to a year or two ago when he was at his peak, he was still getting drafted in like the kind of, I guess, mid-second or so, mid-late second. So in my mind, I thought there was too much risk. Obviously had no idea that there was going to be a sports betting aspect. But what I did consider is like, okay, he took a break from football because of mental health. At no point did we decide, or did we hear that like, hey, he's doing 100% better, that he's 100% into it. So like, we still have to bake in that there was this risk. Also, he'd been away from the game for a year. We don't know what he actually looks like from how that impacted his game. And because you were only getting a round discount from where his upside was previously, that was a player that I wasn't drafting. Now, hypothetically, had he have started dropping to the 5th, 6th round, I definitely would have been taking him just because I'm getting leverage on the field. And because now I think there's a better upside play of, hey, obviously you're getting Calvin Ridley. And if he plays like he did before, you're getting a huge deal. Other than that, I was kind of just looking through like who I was low on and trying to get a feel for them. So at QB, I'm 1% Dak and 4% Burrow. I kind of like both those players, but I think for Burrow, he's just getting drafted much higher. And, it's interesting. I think he's getting drafted as if like we project him to see some form, even 80% of what he did those last couple of weeks with the, 300 plus yard, maybe even like 400 plus yards, all the touchdowns. And I still think like that's a team that even though they're going to be a bit more pass heavy, as we saw the second half of the season, he doesn't have the running floor that probably necessitates where he's getting drafted. So that's why I've kind of been out on him. The Dak was more of just a kind of systematic kind of thing. We knew that there's so many question marks with what the receivers and where they was going to play out. We've seen that play out. And I personally just am not as bullish on that offense as I probably was last year or two. And so that's more of just hey, I want to invest in positive offenses. That's one where I just don't. I think their market was being valued better than I did. Mm-hmm. Running back, I can go through some others. Yeah.
Before we move on, does stacking? How much does stacking drive your drafting now that more people are doing it? Are you finding yourself worrying less about stacks? Do you look ahead at who's going to be more stackable through your draft when you're deciding on, say, what quarterback to play or to take or what wide receiver to take in, round 3 through 5, something like that? What's your relationship with stacking right now?
Yeah, I mean, if more people are stacking, then there's actually added incentive for me to stack because there's a better chance that my wide receiver is going to drop to me because someone else isn't reaching if they're focusing on stacking for their players. I think stacking is extremely still huge. And I think it was Mike Leone did an analysis a year or two ago that said, hey, if you're reaching more than a round to stack, then it's probably costing you more than you're gaining. And that makes complete sense based off what he was looking at. I think what that misses out on, though, is, the importance of really thriving in week 17. Now week 17 because that's a championship week. That's where if you want to finish the very top, like, hey, if I told you a DFS contest, a lot of people are stacking because stacking is what's successful, like you're still going to stack because that's what wins these DFS contests, because there's such high correlation between a quarterback and his pass catchers. And so when these prizes are so top heavy for that championship week, I really want to get as much stackable options as possible, assuming I'm not talking about a quarterback that can really do it on the ground with his legs. I think that's the exception here. So still stacking heavily. Right now, this part of the offseason, it's not as big mine because there's just still so many question marks. Over the next couple of weeks, I'll probably start focusing more on stacking now that we're seeing where people are kind of, playing out. But yeah, in general, stacking still very, very huge, and doesn't matter how much people talk about it, it still needs to be a core part of your focus.
Yeah, it's funny. People get into like a best ball draft room with, notable names, and they're like, "Uh-oh, look who I'm drafting against." But I saw somebody, I forget who said it during the NFL playoff drafting, was like, actually, if you get in a room with some of these guys, it can be a better room because everybody's looking to get their stacks. You're not really, if it's a tournament, you're not really drafting against those people, as much as you are in a typical fantasy draft. You're all drafting toward the top prize. So it kind of behooves everybody to, not collude, but somewhat work together. Like it damages both of your teams if you reach for the receiver that's going to complete somebody else's QB wide receiver stack.
Right. Those playoff contests more than ever. And I actually had a conversation with Nick Redmond from Underdog about this, where you could have 6 people who are not colluding, but they are just drafting optimally. And at the end of the day, they should all just end up with basically 2 different teams. And, what we saw for the playoff challenge, like championships, if you're able to get to the finals, having obviously the Rams and the Bengals was going to win you the nuts. And Eagles ended up, that's what his team was. He went just full on those 2 teams. And so, yeah, with the ideas of these drafts, like obviously stacking is, you're not stacking 2 complete teams like it would in the playoff challenge, but it's still definitely important.
Yeah. So what level is too much? Like if you have a quarterback and a receiver, are you somewhat interested in a second receiver, somewhat interested in a tight end, not interested in getting 2 other pass catchers? Or does it totally depend on when these players are going?
General rule is I want more the merrier. I think an exception was someone was talking about like, what's the unicorn of these drafts? And it's like, okay, so if you were to go, I don't know if it might have been Burrow, Mixon, Higgins, Chase, and such, and or maybe it was someone with the Chiefs and such. But if you're taking, now you have to like spend the top 4 round picks to get those players. I think that's where, okay, maybe we're expanding because you're really missing out on upside from anyone else on another team. And given that final championship week, what's the likelihood of all 4 guys really going off when more you'd rather have 3 of your guys going off and then the whoever the stud is that you're missing from another team. As the draft gets later, I'm more likely to focus on stacking as well, because that's more of a kind of rising tide lifts all ships. And let's think, okay, Kendrick Bourne, if I have Mac Davis and I'm thinking like, okay, I think he's going to have a great season. I think he's going to have even, expand upon his success last year. Kendrick Bourne's probably going to be an element of that. And the difference between the range of outcomes for Kendrick Bourne, knowing that his QB is going to have a great year, gives him a major boost. And that's where, even if you reached on Kendrick Bourne 1 round, the thing is, if I tell you Mac Davis is having a great year, well, now you actually, the expectation for Kendrick is he actually probably should have got for even a round before. And so that's where I think like as long as it's pass catchers, I am more willing to just kind of stack up. I'd say I've had stacks that have 3-4 pass catchers, and I have no problem with that because I'm just making a bet that team is going to have a great season kind of in the air through that QB, and then hope that I hit the right pieces as during that playoffs week.
Right. And certainly going round 15 instead of round 16 to get Kendrick Bourne with Mac Jones, as opposed to reaching from round 5 to round 7. A lot different value picture there. So getting back to some of those individual players, who were some running backs on that list of I guess overvalued at this point?
Yeah. So 2 of my other 1%ers are Chubb and Penny. And I think those have similar themes where great runners, explosive runners, probably like, Penny in those couple games we saw was probably one of the biggest, highest chances of any running back to really break a 50-yard plus pay. Chubb is still considered to be kind of one of the most, one of the top like core runners. but they're not catching passes, and they both have larger offensive risk for like that. You know, what team they're on and what team he might be on with Penny. But if he went back to Seattle. And so those guys, like, I just don't see the upside, and I see a bit more risk. And if I'm drafting for Chubb, if I'm trying to get someone who's a round 2, round 3 running back, I want a chance that he can be like the number 1 RB. Yeah, Penny, I don't know. we can get into Penny, but I don't know. I think it's an interesting case where people saw what happened last year. It was very loud. He has that upside, but he has so many risks just attached to him.
I'm in the same place with you on Penny. I've forced it a couple times just in case something happens with him. I don't want to be totally out. But there's so much more negative than positive to him. If you just look back, I mean, it's classic recency bias to me. You look at the end of last season, and obviously he had a great stretch of games. The matchups were certainly favorable, but he's been in the league 4 years. And if you want to tell yourself the story that he was hurt and then when he finally got healthy, that's when he took off. That's the mistake. That's the same reason you drafted Mike Davis too early last year, is you're ignoring the negative to focus on the positive because of when it happened. I can't get myself to even like Rashad Penny when he's in the same range, not far away from where Clyde Edwards-Helaire is going, who already is in a good spot. Miles Sanders is going later. I mean, it's so easy for me to like Miles Sanders so much more than Rashad Penny. It's been baffling to me that those two have not switched spots throughout draft season.
Yeah, and like if Rashad Penny was catching passes in those few games with Seattle where he broke out, I think I'd be a lot more open to the idea of it, because then there's a story that, okay, so we have the risks of his age, not so much that he's 26, but that he, as you said, he hasn't broke out, hasn't seen the success before. So that's a risk. We have that he was on Seattle, which is a team that in general ran the slowest amount of plays by a long shot. So like, it's not a great offense to be on. But then even if he doesn't go to Seattle, he's a free agent. Yeah. But then what teams are going to go to? And now we're hoping for the potential, but like, he may not even be the starter. He may not even be a 1A. If he is a starter, there's likely someone else that is still going to be catching the passes. So his upside is still capped. And yeah, the other guys that were around him, from Kenneth Walker to Miles Sanders to Tony Pollard, like those all have such a higher upside possibility than what we, and the likelihood of hitting that top 10% outcome than Penny.
It's funny to notice just how strong people's biases can be, that you can realize that second contract running backs are bad bets in general. And yet here you are liking this second contract running back who hasn't even gotten that second contract yet, just because of what you recently saw from him. So let's kind of round out the players before we move on to rookies and such. But
yeah, quickly go through them.
Yeah. About wide receiver and tight end.
The wide receiver, I mentioned Ridley. Terry and Gallup were two others, and a bit more Terry was from a systems wise, just even though he has some phenomenal talent, we didn't expect them to get a legitimate QB. And so I think that's just with the risk around that.
Gallup, that's Terry McLaurin we're talking about, right?
Yes. Yeah. And then Gallup was combination of injury. I actually probably like him a little more after what we've seen now, but I still expected he was going to be like third fiddle in that offense. But we'll see. Tight ends, two guys that are pretty similar, but Dallas Goedert and Hunter Henry. I think 1% of both of them. And the reason why is because that's more of the offensive scheme. They're both run-first offenses. You're just not expecting the likelihood of getting breakout seasons where they're catching 1,000 yards, I think, is very, very slim when both teams want to just run that ball. And from a tight end wise, I want chances of catching that kind of top 3 tight end season. And even though both those have great talent, I don't see it happening in those schemes.
So that Dallas Goedert's interesting, because I know that there are others who like him as an upside guy. I'm kind of in the middle on him. I can see the upside case. I can see the downside case that you're laying out. Are you drafting a lot of Miles Sanders? And I guess, were you treating Jalen Hurts? How are you treating Jalen Hurts?
Yeah, decent amount of Jalen Hurts. Had him a bunch in the more traditional before Superflex because of where he was going and his upside profile. And then Miles Sanders as well. I think Miles Sanders, and I'm at 22% of Miles Sanders. I think the combination there is one is he is that pass catching back. Boston Scott's a free agent, so they're going to lose him. There is obviously still substantial risk with Miles Sanders that they just don't want him in the goal line. And if he's not getting goal line carries, that hurts a bit. But the upside play is there. The other is after Miles Sanders is a huge drop off on talent from running back. So it's pretty much like you have the tier of about Pollard, Kareem Hunt, Miles Sanders, maybe even include Isaiah Spiller right after that. And then you start getting into like Alexander Madison and clear backups. And so that's where I've kind of found myself at, I'm at the running back spot. It's not worth me taking a wide receiver where this next wide receiver is going to be very comparable. Let me grab my favorite of that group, and Miles Sanders is often that.
Do you think that Darren Waller getting Devontae Adams and George Kittle getting a run-first quarterback, maybe not run-first, but run-heavy quarterback, do you think that helps Dallas Goedert? Because to me, that, I don't know, brings the rest of that range of tight end down a little bit and kind of helps the upside on Goddard, especially because there's not that much exciting after him.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, so are you? What would you say your confidence is that the Devontae trade hurts Waller?
I mean, I think it definitely hurts from a target volume standpoint. I guess we'll see on efficiency. I'll be curious to see what it does to his draft position, because I don't think that I would drop Darren Waller in where I would take him if he stays in the same range. It lowers my confidence in him hitting the ceiling from where he's going.
Yeah. I think in PPR, I'd be willing to dock him a little more than Underdog, than half PPR. I agree with you. Like, I think that 160, 170 target season is a little less likely now. But 2 years ago, we loved him because he was literally averaging 10 plus targets a game, converting probably 70, 80% of those into catches. We probably do lose that, but I feel a lot better about that offense now. And it really shows an investment in that they're trying to actually compete against this absolutely stacked division. There's going to be some crazy shootouts. So I don't know. I've been going back and forth the last 24 hours on how I think it impacts Waller. I agree, slight nudge down, but I'm going to buy that dip.
I would say at tight end, I've had a hard time having strong feelings about anybody overall. Like I'll look at the market for them. I'll take some guys. I'll not take some other guys. But it's hard for me to say I hate that guy where he's going. I love this guy where he's going. Is that your feeling on tight ends, where you're not loving and hating as much at other positions?
Every single tight end has a major question mark, and relative to where they're drafting, like. Kelsey, even his age, has to be a question mark.
Right.
Kyle Pitts with potentially a new quarterback. Like, who knows what's happening there? Mark Andrews cannot sustain the level of touchdowns and efficiency and yards that he was getting in a team that wants to run first. You keep going, Darren Waller, his situation. George Kittle with a new quarterback that wants to run. And you know that he preferred Jimmy Garoppolo over Trey Lance from some of his comments. Like, you go all the way. I mean, Hawkinson, like that. Like, there's no great tight ends that I love. I still am. I think part of the reason why I drafted a bunch of Waller is because he's got a discount compared to those other top tier ones, and we know that upside is still there. But other than that, I've been just getting a bunch of the Tyler Higbee, Logan Thomas, which are going 140, 150 ADP, and those just feel fine to me.
Logan Thomas is one of those zero for me, just because he tore his ACL so late in the year. I got to see it before I'm buying in, especially because to me the ceiling's like tight end 10 this season for him, so I'm not worried about missing out on something special.
Yeah, see, I think that's the kind of upside that I'm hoping for. And we've seen how much Washington loves to use that tight end spot. Like, we were even doing, fill-ins when you had a backup third tight end in DFS there, because we know that they just it's a system where they'll continue to use it. So I think a healthy Logan Thomas could be a top 5 tight end season.
Ooh, all right. I guess we'll see where that goes. Let's switch to the rookies before I let you out of here. A good time to be drafting rookies in best ball, right? Because they're just collectively going to move up once they have NFL teams.
Yeah, and I think it fits the perfect profile of the risk reward. And I think also we've seen more than ever the level of hive mind that has come from the current people who are drafting rookies. 99% of us don't know that much about them. Maybe we have strong opinions on one or two, but we're likely just, reading and learning from regurgitated information from others, and you get hive mind around these rookies. And so I think there's an opportunity to zig when others are zagging in this spot. But overall, I've just accepted that, like, I don't know that much about them. I use basically the mock drafts compilation to get an idea of draft capital, because I think that's probably most important for most of these positions. And from there, just say, hey, I'm trying to load up on wide receivers. I've been trying to load up on wide receiver rookies because I think, hey, if you can hit that upside, it's fantastic. I've been down on running back rookies because I think outside of like Breece Hall, it's just not that great of a class. And I think we're kind of overvaluing, hoping that we hit. But overall, like, I think it's just hey, lean into the lack of clarity.
Yeah, and a good place to spread around the ownership, because none of us, even the folks who know the most, don't know a whole lot about these guys, because the NFL shows us every year that they don't know a ton about these guys until they hit the league. I saw you mention Jameson Williams in particular as somebody that you want. Tell me what you like. We all know he's a good player, so tell me what you like about him as a best ball pick right now in particular. So, especially considering he's coming off the knee injury.
Yeah, I think it applies more generally, but I think highly specific to the super flex format where you only need to start 2 wide receivers. And so he's going around pick like 144, 145 or something like that. And when I'm looking at wide receivers in that range, I want wide receivers that have a chance to be, one of my top 2 on any week. And that's where we know that, like, hey, if he stayed healthy, he'd be arguably the number 1 wide receiver in the draft, probably moves up to top 2, 3. Like, there's a little fluidity up there. I've even seen some projections like he's still like projected to go 4th off the board with this injury. And I'm drafting for the championships. I'm drafting for those playoffs where he will be healthy. And there's a nice little aspect too. Well, he's likely going to get drafted in the back half of the first round, which means he's getting drafted on a better team, which means that, like, better quarterback he may be that like league winner for the playoffs because the value you're getting. And we're willing to take in that, hey, yes, he probably doesn't play for the first 4-6 weeks. Maybe even there's a time to ramp up and everything. But come playoffs, that's when I want him on my teams.
Is he somebody that you'd be less interested in a full season format? One that doesn't have the one and done playoff thing at the end. It's just counting all of your points for the year.
Oh, 100%. Right. Because now you've got to bake into account that you're likely getting a dud. And so the comparable player, not comparable player, I guess maybe a little comparable actually, but at the ADP is Will Fuller. And Will Fuller has substantial upside as well. We also know his risk is a little different with the injury aspects. But if I'm going in a full season, not a full season one where every week counts, I'd probably be more willing to invest in Will Fuller, because you're not getting those guaranteed zeros or that ramp up time from the beginning of the year.
Mm-hmm. Is there any player valuation trend that you've seen year to year, I guess, that people are continuing to make? We've talked about, a couple of different things along the way. So maybe it's one of those, or maybe there's something different. Is there just like a general thing that people are getting wrong and it's leading to value staying on the board?
Honestly, I think each year people adapt and things change.
Mm-hmm.
And so a couple years back, I'd say 2-3 years back, we were like, no, we should not be taking free agent wide receivers. They never perform well. Then you had that year where the top 3 was Stephon Diggs. It was maybe Hopkins, went to new teams and absolutely thrived. And then last year we had again, just about every wide receiver that went to a new team absolutely stunk. And I have no idea if this is right, but my kind of intuition, the way that I see it is okay, so if it's an elite wide receiver going to a new team and he's going to be the focal point, I can see that working out. And there is some, anecdotal evidence for the Stephon Diggs and the DeAndre Hopkins. So maybe that works for Devontae, but then your peripheral ones that are not the focal part, it takes them longer to actually get into a new offense. There's more variance. They're less likely to work out. I don't know. That's the way I kind of conceptually think about it, but no idea if that's accurate. No, and it seems like the larger hive will just shift and flow each time. And so maybe I try to say hey, here's what I believe. I see that instead right now everyone's taking an extreme view and thinking okay, the top wide receiver, or the new wide receivers aren't going to succeed. So you can buy the dip, but I wouldn't say there's like a tried and true year over year trend for anything. And it's honestly impressed me how much the field is willing to disregard previous years, and kind of, for better or for worse, go into like new thoughts, new processes.
Yeah, it used to be we could count on certain guys being overrated. I think that's been less the case year to year at this point. But, there are still two key things at play, and Stephon Diggs is a good example. One is factoring in what could happen and not just what you think will happen. I know for a lot of us who do this projecting, for a living or for a hobby or whatever it is, it's tough to get away from what I think will happen, but you have to, because we don't know everything that's going to happen. So with Stephon Diggs, obviously the big change is Buffalo started throwing the ball a lot more all of a sudden after getting him, which after the fact makes sense. But a lot of us didn't like Stephon Diggs as much because he was going to run heavy Buffalo. And then the other thing,
at that time, people didn't like Josh Allen.
Right.
So, yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, that was the perfect storm. It was like Josh Allen was all of a sudden a really good thrower. All of a sudden, Buffalo threw the ball. All of a sudden, they had a number one wide receiver. So, and then the final piece of that was Stephon Diggs, I think, was going in round 5 in ADP at that point. So you weren't investing an early round 2 pick to take a shot on Stephon Diggs paying off. So, even though we are all getting sharper at drafting and you can't count on the same mistakes that we used to see, there are still some spots that you can pay a little bit more attention to and find value that other people might be missing.
Yep. I think an interesting litmus test this year is going to be Allen Robinson, because he probably has one of the widest range of outcomes for a free agent wide receiver, where going into a system where if he ends up being a focal part, if Cooper Kupp was to get hurt or something, he could be a top 5 wide receiver. Or he goes into that system and it's already established and you already have so many other mouths to feed and we have no idea what happens with Woods or Beckham or such. And he ends up just, having a couple of spike weeks, but for the most part is only catching 3-4 passes a week. And that's just the best for their offense. Like, I have no idea. That's going to be a very interesting one. I think I tweeted out, I think his ADP is going to get steamed because people are going to be attracted to the upside and think old Allen Robinson and now in better offense, put those two together and he's going to be great. If that's the case, I'm probably out on him if his ADP ends up getting into that 4th round, 5th round area. Where do we think? I don't know. I haven't thought about this, but where do we think his ADP is actually going to settle? 5th round?
It's a tough spot because obviously he lands on a good offense, but he currently also resides with Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods. Van Jefferson, nobody likes, but he's still there. So, I mean, it's also easy to make the case that he didn't land in a great spot because of opportunity. I don't know. I haven't done a live draft since he signed to know where he went specifically. It's tough for me to imagine he makes a big leap until and unless Robert Woods gets traded away.
Yeah, so he was 88 in the non-super flex, which would be early 7th round. You got to imagine. I mean, there wasn't much of a better landing spot for him just from a upside. I think late 5th. I think 5th probably makes sense about it. I think I'd probably take him at his current spot, but yeah, we'll see. It'll be interesting because if that's a case where if you're able to draft him where his upside is not really being baked in, I'm willing to take that risk.
That's one of the best things about how we can draft throughout the year now is I took Allen Robinson when he was, wide receiver 45. Now, if he's wide receiver 30, I'm like, I don't need him right now. I already got some. So it's a great time to be alive, Justin. He is a proven best ball warrior. You can find his stuff at Establish the Run. Justin, anything in particular that people should be looking for from you, either right now or on the horizon?
Yeah, no, lots of fun stuff. And so for those don't know, last year, we started a company called Own the Moment that started building a fantasy sports with digital trading cards, so NFTs. And so we rolled out a playoff best ball style contest last year. That was pretty fun, where you open a pack and in your pack, you got 20 cards that are teams and positions. And then from those 20, you pick 12 and that became your best ball lineup for the playoffs. And so we've got a lot planned and may have some summer best ball as well for this year. Yeah, feel free to reach out. Follow me on Twitter. Love to chat with anyone, anything just best ball related. I'd love to have these conversations. So good, looking forward to connecting with all you.
Yeah. Sounds good. Follow him on Twitter at Justin Herzig. Justin, thanks again for joining me on here.
Cheers, Nat.
If you are grinding best ball drafts right now, head to draftsharks.com. You can become a DS Insider. Our 2022 rankings are live. Our unrivaled draft war room is live. We're basically just waiting there to help you win. Even if you're not a DS Insider yet, you can check out our free Dynasty Prospect Scouting Report series. We are 9 players into this year's rookie class. More coming basically every day up until the NFL draft, so check that out. For my guest, Justin Herzig, and the entire Draft Sharks crew, I'm Matt Schauf saying thanks so much for swimming with us.